There's a certain expectation we have of sequels to games. Even if everything isn't brand spanking new, we expect sequels to build upon what worked in a previous game while still providing a new experience. Oftentimes, they'll be designed on top of a fresh new engine, but even if they are not, they actually have to feel like a new game. This is what we've come to accept as standard. But what about the titles that take shortcuts? Two games recently exhibited such qualities, but the reasons for each are quite interesting. Let me draw your attention to Saints Row 4. Never has there been more tragic of a story than that of the game's car designer. The already substantial car customization of Saints Row the 3rd was amped up in the next release, but is one of the few cases in games where an entire feature becomes worthless within hours of starting the game. The big additions to the series were a sci-fi fight the aliens plot, and superpowers which gave you flight, super speed, and force-based attacks. This is fortunate because everything else feels copied over from the third game. The story and missions were entirely new, some new weapons were created, some structures were added to the map of Steelport, and, of course, the car customization was improved, but almost everything else is a carbon copy of Saints Row 3. The map is exactly the same, with some assets added or sometimes just swapped to give it a digital aesthetic. The game feels more like an expandalone like Gat Out of Hell than a true sequel. That's what makes the game so intriguing. Saints Row 4 was originally designed as DLC for Saints Row 3, but questions of where the series could go after turning it up to 11 already must have sparked a change in focus. As a result, the DLC became the game. It was also a product of the times for THQ, a company struggling to make ends meet. As a result, they most likely rushed the production of Volition's game in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Where the developers would normally look to freshen up the entire experience, they made use of their already created assets as a potential source of more revenue. Interestingly, the game was met with great commercial success, and the main complaint was over the addition of superpowers instead of the regurgitation of assets. THQ, however, never survived to see the profit. To act as a counter to this success, we have the sequel to my personal gaming sweetheart, Sleeping Dogs. The game boasts a brilliant melee combat system established by the Arkham series, and an open-world mission structure very similar to that of Grand Theft Auto, though extra flourishes were added thanks to its Triad movie roots, such as environmental kills and the ability to jump to another car to jack it. The gameplay as a whole is an amalgamation of other titles to make a refined but not entirely unique experience. What sets it apart is its beautiful setting, brilliant characters, and its battle with common writing tropes. The world is densely packed, with black market street vendors, authentic Cantonese dialogue, and cockfighting. As in, with birds. The game turns the undercover cop trope on its head by making the Triad members incredibly likeable, and the attachment people had to the game and its inhabitants are what sealed it as a cult classic, albeit a low-profile one.
咗錢都唔值得，阿威啊！呢種生意會令人黐線嘅。
That's the thing. Square Enix's viral marketing strategy did little to create hype leading up to its release, and many of those who did buy the game were left unimpressed by the uninspired first hours of the experience. Despite selling nearly 2 million units, Square Enix declared the game a commercial failure, and most of us who grew to love it bought it in a Steam sale. Fast forward 3 years, and United Front Games bestow upon us Triad Wars, a free-to-play, asynchronous multiplayer brawler. The gameplay was the same, the map of Hong Kong was identical, and do you see the problem yet? It's not Sleeping Dogs. It had the gameplay of Sleeping Dogs, arguably the least interesting part of the original game, but it lacks the substance that the story and world building gave to the game. What we're left with is a husk of a game, with most assets being lifted directly from Sleeping Dogs, with only minor tweaks to the core gameplay. It was a pretty boring, generic free-to-play PC title at a time when Square Enix was uncertain of the next generation of consoles, and didn't want to relive the troubled development and release of Sleeping Dogs. As such, we got Triad Wars, a game that lasted a year in beta before closing down forever. Very few people missed it, and hopes for Sleeping Dogs 2 were dashed. Both are examples of games that prioritised efficiency over revitalising, whilst at the same time introducing dramatic changes. For Saints Row 4, it was in the form of a tonal shift from crude humour to sci-fi references, and from wanton destruction to flying around the city. For Triad Wars, it was a shift from a story-driven single-player experience to a profit-driven free-to-play brawler. However, both have very different stories to tell. It's incredibly difficult to successfully reuse the majority of your assets for another game. It's very easy for players to notice, and harms the experience for many people playing. Perhaps worst of all, it reminds players of the previous game, where everything was brand new, and how much more interesting it was than the new title, which relies too much on its predecessor. It's a new game, and when the whole experience isn't fresh, it often lays stagnant in the mind, especially when expectations are set for something completely new. When that's the standard, why bother with a game mostly rehashing what's already been done? There's definitely a balance that can be struck, but knowing where it is and where to draw the line are very hard to determine. It may be a simpler project in terms of budget, but not so much in terms of design. As we look ahead, we see both Volition and United Front rejuvenating their games, and moving on from the assets they relied on for so long. Old habits die hard though, and even now questions have been raised of how similar the new games will be to their older titles. For United Front, they've moved from a free-to-play online brawler to a competitive multiplayer brawler entitled Smash and Grab, a brawler that in fact seems pretty similar to the gameplay they developed under Sleeping Dogs, but lacking Squeenix's loved IP that was both a blessing and a hindrance. Meanwhile, Volition's Agents of Mayhem seems like an interesting new direction for the studio, but the purple and fleur-de-lis synonymous with the Saints Row franchise is still very present in this new game, blurring lines further. Unlike most developers, these two have been left in a peculiar situation where their new games aren't met with how good is it, so much as how much is it like the last one.